"Millie, I'm divorcing you to marry Bernice. She's pregnant with my child and I don't need a caregiver anymore," my husband Howard announced into the microphone at our church's anniversary celebration, while 200 congregation members watched me realize I'd worked 2 jobs for 18 months to fund his affair with the woman I'd hired to help him recover from his stroke. The sanctuary floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet like I was experiencing the stroke Howard had been faking for over a year. The same hands that had guided disabled students through recovery for 38 years began shaking as I stared at my husband standing confidently at the podium. The same man who'd claimed he couldn't walk without assistance just that morning. Around me, the church buzzed with shocked whispers. Congregation members, church leadership, family friends, all witnessing the destruction of a marriage they'd been praying for and supporting through my supposed sacrifice. Howard stepped down from the podium with steady, confident strides, walking normally toward Bernice, who sat in the front row with her hand protectively over what was apparently my husband's child. The same man who'd needed my help getting to the bathroom just hours earlier was now moving like someone who'd never had a stroke at all. "Howard, you're walking," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the stunned silence filling the sanctuary. "I've been walking for months, Millie," Howard replied, his voice carrying that casual cruelty designed for maximum public impact. "I just needed you to keep working those night shifts to pay for Bernice's salary while we figured out our future together. My name is Mildred Brennan. I'm 65 years old, and this is the story of how I discovered my husband Howard had been systematically deceiving me while I funded his lies. He thought my caregiving instincts made me blind, that my special education background made me gullible about disability, that my love for family made me an easy target. But what he didn't know was that the same expertise that had protected disabled students for 38 years was about to expose their coordinated betrayal and help me reclaim my independence in ways they never saw coming. If this situation resonates with your soul, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. $72,000, I said, the number hitting me like a physical blow as I stared at Bernice. That's what I'd paid her over 18 months, money I'd earned working night shifts at the grocery store and weekend shifts at the diner while maintaining my exhausting caregiving schedule. Money that had funded my husband's affair while I believed I was paying for his medical recovery. "What are you talking about, Millie?" Pastor Williams asked, approaching the microphone with the confused concern of someone trying to manage a crisis during a sacred celebration. $72,000 in caregiver fees, I said, my voice growing stronger as my special education training kicked in. Money I earned working 2 jobs to pay for Howard's recovery from a stroke that he's apparently been faking for 18 months. But it gets worse. "Bernice, how far along are you?" I asked, looking at the woman I'd hired, trained, and trusted to help my husband recover. 6 months, Bernice replied, her voice barely a whisper as she realized the entire congregation was calculating the timeline of her pregnancy against Howard's supposed disability. 6 months pregnant, which meant Howard had been physically capable of fathering a child while I was working myself to exhaustion, believing he needed round-the-clock care for basic functions. "Howard, this morning you needed help getting dressed," I said, my voice taking on the professional authority I'd used when advocating for disabled students. "You claimed you couldn't manage buttons or zippers. How did you manage to get Bernice pregnant?" The laughter that rippled through the congregation wasn't kind. It was the sound of 200 people realizing they'd been watching systematic fraud, disguised as devoted caregiving. "Millie, you're embarrassing yourself," Howard said, but his voice lacked the confidence he'd shown moments earlier. "Everyone knows you've been struggling with the stress of caregiving." Struggling with stress. The narrative he'd been building to explain away any questions I might raise about his inconsistent symptoms or miraculous recovery moments. "I'm a special education teacher with 38 years of experience working with stroke patients," I announced to the congregation. "I know the difference between genuine disability and performed limitations, and I know that someone who needs help with basic motor functions doesn't father children." The silence that followed was deafening. 200 congregation members who'd prayed for Howard's recovery, who'd praised my devotion, who'd watched me work myself to exhaustion, were beginning to understand they'd been witnessing systematic fraud. "Mrs. Brennan," called out Dr. Sarah Chen from the congregation, "I've been Howard's physical therapist for 6 months. His medical records show capabilities that don't match what you're describing." Medical records. Professional documentation that would either support or destroy Howard's disability claims in front of our entire church community. "Howard, I want to see every medical report, every therapy note, every piece of documentation from the past 18 months, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd used when fighting for students' rights for nearly 4 decades. The man who'd spent 18 months manipulating my caregiving instincts looked like someone whose perfect deception had just been exposed by the woman whose professional expertise he'd underestimated for over a year. They'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that love and exhaustion would override 38 years of special education training in recognizing genuine versus performed disability. The next morning, I sat in my home office, surrounded by 18 months of medical records, caregiver schedules, and work timesheets that were revealing themselves as evidence of systematic fraud and exploitation. The same methodical approach I'd used to track student progress for 38 years was now exposing the conspiracy that had stolen my health, my savings, and my understanding of marriage. Every bad day with Howard's recovery, every time he'd needed extra help that required me to work additional shifts, every medical appointment where his symptoms seemed inconsistent with stroke recovery patterns I'd seen in my special education students, he'd been performing disability while I exhausted myself funding his affair. I pulled out my caregiver payment records from the past 18 months, meticulous documentation I'd kept for tax purposes. The pattern was devastating. Every time I'd questioned Howard's inconsistent symptoms, Bernice's hours had mysteriously increased, requiring me to work more shifts to cover her salary. But it gets worse. I found my work schedules and cross-referenced them with Howard's recovery milestones. March 2023, I worked 60 hours that week to pay for Bernice's specialized therapy sessions. March 2023, Howard's medical notes showed significant improvement in motor function that somehow disappeared whenever I was home. June 2023, I took on weekend shifts to cover emergency care needs. June 2023, Howard's therapy reports documented capabilities he never demonstrated in my presence. They'd been timing his fake disability performance around my work schedule to maximize both my absence and my financial exhaustion. My phone rang, interrupting my investigation. "Millie, it's Pastor Williams. The church board needs to discuss what happened yesterday. Can you come in this afternoon?" "Of course, Pastor. I think the congregation deserves to understand what they witnessed." "Millie, I have to ask, are you certain about these accusations?" Howard seemed genuinely disabled when he attended church functions. Church functions, where Howard had performed his disability for our entire congregation while I worked multiple jobs to fund the woman who was helping him maintain the deception. "Pastor, I've been reviewing 18 months of medical records. Howard's documented capabilities don't match the limitations he's been showing me at home." After I hung up, I called Dr. Sarah Chen, the physical therapist who'd spoken up during yesterday's revelation. "Dr. Chen, I need to understand something about Howard's treatment records." "Mrs. Brennan, I'm glad you called. I've been concerned about the discrepancies in Howard's case for months." "What kind of discrepancies?" "Howard's therapy sessions showed consistent improvement and normal function, but Bernice kept reporting that he was having severe setbacks at home. It never made medical sense. Severe setbacks at home. While I was working night shifts, Howard was apparently demonstrating normal function during therapy, then performing disability when I returned home exhausted." "Dr. Chen, did Bernice ever discuss Howard's home care needs with you?" "Frequently. She claimed he needed round-the-clock assistance for basic functions, which contradicted everything I observed during our sessions. I started documenting the inconsistencies because they seemed medically impossible." Medical impossibilities. A physical therapist had been documenting evidence of Howard's fake disability for months, while I worked myself to exhaustion believing his performance. But it gets worse. I drove to the grocery store where I'd worked night shifts for 18 months, using my employee access to review my timesheet records. What I found made my hands shake with rage. Every time Howard had claimed a medical emergency that required expensive care adjustments, I'd immediately picked up extra shifts to cover the costs. The store manager, Mrs. Patterson, approached me with concern. "Millie, how are you holding up after yesterday? The whole town's talking about what happened at church. I'm discovering that the medical emergencies that kept me working here weren't emergencies at all." "Honey, I have to tell you something. Several times when you were working night shifts, I saw Howard at the diner with that caregiver woman. They didn't look like patient and nurse. They looked like a couple on dates. While I was stocking shelves at midnight to pay Bernice's salary, she and Howard were having romantic dinners funded by my exhaustion. Mrs. Patterson, do you remember when these sightings occurred? I kept track because I was worried about you. Every time you picked up extra shifts for medical emergencies, Howard seemed to be out socializing within days. I called my former teaching colleague Janet, who'd watched me struggle through 18 months of caregiving while maintaining my work schedule. "Janet, I need to ask you something honestly. Did Howard's disability ever seem consistent to you?" "Oh, honey," Janet's voice was heavy with sympathy. "I've been wondering when you'd start questioning it." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Millie, you're a special education expert. You've worked with stroke patients for decades. Howard's symptoms never matched any recovery pattern you taught us about. We all assumed you were too emotionally involved to see it objectively." Too emotionally involved. My own professional colleagues had recognized that Howard's disability performance was medically inconsistent, but they'd assumed I was too close to the situation to apply my expertise. "Janet, why didn't anyone say anything?" "Because you seemed so devoted to his care. So determined to do everything possible for his recovery. We thought questioning his condition would seem cruel." That evening, Howard returned home from wherever he'd been staying since yesterday's revelation. "Millie, we need to talk about this situation rationally." Rationally. The word he'd been using for 18 months to dismiss my questions about his inconsistent symptoms. "Howard, I've been reviewing your medical records. Your physical therapy reports show normal function that you've never demonstrated at home." His face went pale. "Those reports don't tell the whole story. They tell the story of someone who's been systematically performing disability while his wife worked herself to exhaustion funding his affair." For the first time in 18 months, Howard looked genuinely afraid. The confident man who'd announced his divorce and affair to our entire congregation looked like someone whose perfect deception had been exposed by the woman whose professional expertise he'd underestimated. They'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that emotional exhaustion would override 38 years of special education training in recognizing the difference between genuine disability and systematic performance. That afternoon at the church office, Pastor Williams spread Howard's medical records across his desk under the same fluorescent lights where we'd planned countless community service projects. But this time, instead of organizing charity work, we were examining evidence of systematic fraud that had deceived our entire congregation. "Millie, these therapy reports are disturbing," Pastor Williams said, his voice tight with professional concern. "Howard's documented capabilities are completely inconsistent with the disability he's been displaying at church functions." I leaned forward, studying the medical documentation with the same analytical eye that had built my special education reputation. "Pastor, look at the dates. Every time Howard showed improvement in therapy, it corresponded with periods when I was working extra shifts and couldn't attend his appointments." "So you're saying he was performing normally when you weren't present?" "I'm saying Howard has been systematically deceiving medical professionals while performing disability for me and our church community." But as I sat in that familiar office, surrounded by the documentation I'd trusted for 18 months, something clicked into place that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about the affair or even the fake disability. "Pastor, can you pull up the timeline when Howard's care needs started increasing?" He scrolled through the medical files. "Looks like the major escalation began about 8 months ago." "Why?" 8 months ago. 2 weeks after I'd mentioned to Howard that I was considering early retirement from my night job because my teaching pension was finally sufficient to support us both. 2 weeks after I'd talked about wanting to spend more time together during his recovery. "They weren't just stealing my money," I said. the realization hitting like a physical blow. They were systematically preventing me from having time to observe Howard's real capabilities. Pastor Williams's face darkened. What do you mean? Every time I showed signs of reducing my work hours, Howard's medical needs mysteriously increased, requiring more expensive care that forced me back to exhausting work schedules. They were using my absence to facilitate their affair, while ensuring I was too tired to question his performance. But it gets worse. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through text messages I'd found on Howard's hidden device. Messages between him and Bernice that revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. Look at this, I said, showing Pastor Williams the screen. Howard texting Bernice, Millie's getting suspicious about my recovery inconsistencies. We need to create another setback to keep her working nights. And Bernice's response, I'll document regression in his motor skills. That should justify increasing my hours and keeping her too busy to attend appointments. Pastor Williams stared at the messages, his face pale with horror. They were coordinating to deceive you systematically. There's more, I said, scrolling to another exchange. Bernice writing, the pregnancy is starting to show. We need to accelerate the timeline for having Millie declared an unfit caregiver so I can take over completely. Unfit caregiver. They'd been planning to use my work exhaustion they'd systematically created as evidence that I was neglecting Howard's care, justifying Bernice's complete takeover of his treatment. Pastor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Over the past 18 months, when I've talked about Howard's care needs during church functions, did his behavior seem consistent with what I was describing? Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment. Millie, several church members have mentioned concerns about inconsistencies in Howard's condition. He seemed much more capable during men's fellowship meetings than you described at home. Several church members. My own congregation had noticed that Howard's disability performance was inconsistent, but no one had questioned it directly. Why didn't anyone say anything? Because you're a special education expert, Millie. We assumed that if anyone would recognize fake disability, it would be you. We thought we must be misunderstanding his condition. The irony was devastating. My professional expertise had made people trust Howard's performance more, not less, because they assumed I would have detected any deception. But the revelation that made me physically sick came when I found Howard's medical appointment schedule cross-referenced with Bernice's pregnancy timeline. Pastor, look at this pattern. Every time Bernice had prenatal appointments, Howard's therapy sessions were mysteriously canceled due to setbacks that required me to work extra shifts. So while you were working to pay for care he didn't need, he was attending prenatal appointments for the child they conceived while I was funding their affair through my exhaustion. I sat back in Pastor Williams's chair, staring at 18 months of evidence that revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. This wasn't just an affair that had produced a secret pregnancy. This was systematic exploitation designed to extract every hour of my labor while destroying my ability to recognize their deception. The woman who'd spent 38 years protecting disabled students from exploitation had been turned into a victim in her own home, but they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that emotional exhaustion and caregiving devotion would override decades of professional training in recognizing genuine versus performed disability. They'd treated me like a naive wife instead of what I actually was, a special education expert with nearly 4 decades of experience detecting exactly the kind of systematic performance they'd been using against me. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Sarah Chen. Dr. Chen, I need your help building a comprehensive case that exposes Howard's fake disability performance. Absolutely, Mrs. Brennan. I have 18 months of documentation showing the medical impossibility of Howard's claimed limitations. For the first time in 18 months, I felt something that had nothing to do with exhaustion or caregiving duty. It was the same protective instinct that had made me an effective special education advocate for nearly 4 decades, the ability to recognize when vulnerable people were being systematically exploited and the determination to stop it. They thought they were deceiving a tired, devoted wife. They were about to discover they'd been performing fake disability for someone who'd made a career of catching people who tried to manipulate the system designed to protect genuinely disabled individuals. The special education expert was about to conduct the most important disability assessment of her career. The next morning, I did what I'd done for 38 years as a special education teacher. I built a comprehensive case based on irrefutable documentation and expert testimony. But instead of advocating for disabled students, I was gathering evidence to prosecute the systematic fake disability performance that had stolen 18 months of my life and $72,000 of my earnings. My dining room became a disability fraud command center. Medical records organized by date, work schedules sorted by correlation with Howard's setbacks, physical therapy reports showing capabilities he'd never demonstrated at home. The same methodical approach that had made me a respected special education advocate was now focused on delivering justice for systematic performance fraud. But I had advantages Howard and Bernice didn't know about. "Pastor Williams, it's Millie. I need to discuss something critical before we proceed with church discipline." "Of course. What is it?" "I have retirement funds Howard doesn't know about. My teaching pension includes a special education supplement that's been accumulating separately, $180,000 in assets that he can't access or claim in any divorce proceedings." The silence told me Pastor Williams understood the implications immediately. "Millie, that means you have financial independence they can't manipulate, plus the resources to pursue comprehensive legal action." Independent resources. For the first time in 18 months of exhausting work schedules, I had money that Howard couldn't exploit, couldn't use to justify fake medical expenses, couldn't manipulate to keep me working multiple jobs. "There's more, Pastor. Dr. Sarah Chen is willing to provide expert testimony about Howard's fake disability performance, and I have documentation from my special education career that proves I'm qualified to assess genuine versus performed limitations." "So you have professional credibility they can't undermine?" "I have 38 years of disability assessment expertise, medical documentation proving systematic fraud, and expert testimony from healthcare professionals who've been documenting Howard's deception." But it gets worse for them. I called Detective Morrison, who'd handled fraud cases in our county for years. "Detective, this is Millie Brennan. I need to report systematic disability fraud, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." "Mrs. Brennan, I remember you from the school district. What's the situation?" "My husband has been performing fake disability for 18 months while conducting an affair with the caregiver I hired and worked 2 jobs to pay. Systematically stealing $72,000 while planning to have me declared an unfit caregiver so his affair partner could take over completely." "Jesus, Millie, how much evidence do you have?" "Complete medical records showing systematic fake disability performance, financial documentation of exploitation, expert testimony from physical therapists, and text messages between the conspirators detailing their fraud and timeline for removing me from Howard's care." "Can you come in this afternoon?" "Bring everything." That afternoon, I drove to my former school district, the place where I'd built my special education reputation over nearly 4 decades. What Howard didn't know was that I'd maintained my professional relationships and disability assessment credentials throughout his supposed recovery. "Mrs. Brennan, it's wonderful to see you," my former principal Dr. Martinez said. "How are you managing Howard's care? We heard about his stroke." "I'm managing it very well now that I understand what was actually happening," I replied, settling into his office chair. "Dr. Martinez, I need your help with a very serious disability fraud case." "Of course. What kind of case?" "Systematic fake disability performance designed to exploit a caregiver's work schedule and financial resources. I need expert testimony that will hold up in criminal court." Dr. Martinez's face went serious. "Millie, are you saying someone has been performing fake disability?" "I'm saying my husband has been systematically deceiving medical professionals while exploiting my special education background to make his performance seem credible to our community." But my most powerful weapon wasn't just evidence, it was my professional network. I called my former colleague Janet, who'd worked with me in special education for 20 years. "Janet, I need expert consultation on systematic disability fraud." "Millie, what's happened?" "I've been the victim of an 18-month fake disability conspiracy. I need professional validation that my assessment expertise hasn't declined." and that the performance I've discovered represents systematic fraud. You have it, Millie. You're one of the most competent disability assessment professionals I've ever worked with. Anyone who questions your expertise is either ignorant or complicit. I called the State Disability Rights Organization, where I'd served on advisory committees for years. This is Millie Brennan. I need to report systematic disability fraud that's been exploiting special education expertise. Mrs. Brennan, we remember your advocacy work. What do you need? I need expert testimony that fake disability performance represents fraud against both caregivers and the disability community. And I need support for prosecution that will prevent others from exploiting special education professionals. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Howard had performed his morning disability routine for 18 months, and felt something I hadn't experienced since before his supposed stroke: complete control over my own time, energy, and professional credibility. Howard came home at his usual time, but his confident demeanor from the church announcement had been replaced by the nervous energy of someone whose perfect fraud was unraveling. "Millie, we need to discuss this situation reasonably," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We are discussing it reasonably. Through the criminal justice system," I replied. Looking up from the disability fraud evidence files I was organizing, I met with Detective Morrison about systematic fraud charges, consulted with disability rights advocates about exploitation prosecution, and secured expert testimony from my special education colleagues. Howard's face went ashen. Systematic fraud charges? Fake disability performance with intent to exploit, conspiracy to commit financial abuse, and fraud against the disability community. Detective Morrison was very interested in the medical records, your text messages with Bernice, and my professional assessment of your systematic performance. For the first time in 39 years of marriage, Howard looked genuinely terrified. The confident man who'd announced his divorce and affair to our entire congregation looked like a criminal whose perfect disability fraud had been exposed by the woman whose expertise he'd systematically underestimated. "Millie, you can't prove." "I can prove everything. I'm a special education expert with 38 years of experience detecting fake disability performance. You've been performing for someone who literally wrote the protocols for recognizing systematic fraud." The special education advocate had become the prosecutor, and the evidence was overwhelming. Sunday morning service at our church arrived with the same congregation that had witnessed Howard's shocking announcement just 1 week earlier. But this time, the conspirators didn't know they were walking into a confrontation orchestrated by someone who'd spent 38 years building disability advocacy cases that exposed fraud and protected vulnerable individuals. "Millie, you look different today," Howard said as he walked into the sanctuary, moving with the same confident stride he displayed during his divorce announcement. "More determined." "I'm feeling very clear today, Howard," I replied, carrying the leather briefcase I'd once used for IEP meetings and disability assessments. "Clearer than I've been in 18 months. Bernice entered beside him, as she always did when they attended church together, as the patient and caregiver everyone had believed them to be. Around the sanctuary sat the same 200 congregation members who'd watched Howard's fake disability performance, church leadership, family friends, community members who'd prayed for his recovery while I worked myself to exhaustion. "Before service begins," I announced, standing up with the professional authority that had commanded respect for 4 decades, "I have something important to share with our church family." Pastor Williams nodded from the pulpit, having coordinated this moment after reviewing all the evidence I'd gathered. "The floor is yours, Millie." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the organized evidence files, displaying them with the same systematic approach I'd used when presenting disability assessments to school committees. Last Sunday, Howard announced he was divorcing me to marry Bernice, who's pregnant with his child. Today, I want to share what I've discovered about the 18 months leading up to that announcement. The congregation fell silent, but this time, the silence belonged to me. These are medical records showing Howard demonstrated normal physical function during therapy sessions while performing severe disability at home. I held up the documentation. These are work schedules showing I worked $72,000 worth of extra shifts to pay for care Howard didn't actually need. And these are text messages between Howard and Bernice, planning to have me declared an unfit caregiver so she could take over his treatment completely. The congregation members who'd sympathized with my sacrifice were now staring at Howard and Bernice with growing understanding. But it gets worse, I continued, pulling out the timeline analysis. Here's documentation showing that every time I mentioned reducing my work hours, Howard's medical needs mysteriously increased, forcing me back to exhausting schedules that prevented me from observing his real capabilities. The shock on their faces was complete, but I wasn't finished delivering accountability. Detective Morrison has reviewed all evidence. Criminal charges were filed yesterday morning for systematic disability fraud, financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I looked directly at Howard and Bernice. The arrest warrants are being executed after service. But the most devastating moment came when Dr. Sarah Chen stood up from the congregation. "I need to say something as Howard's physical therapist," Dr. Chen announced. "For months, I've been documenting medical impossibilities in Howard's case. He demonstrated normal function during our sessions, while Bernice reported severe limitations at home. What Millie discovered is systematic fraud that exploited her special education expertise and caregiving devotion." The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs as they realized they'd been witnessing not devoted caregiving, but systematic exploitation disguised as medical recovery. "Howard, stand up," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd used when advocating for disabled students. "Show this congregation the physical capabilities you've been hiding for 18 months. Howard remained seated, but his confident demeanor had crumbled. "Millie, you're embarrassing yourself. Stand up, Howard. Walk to the front of the church like you did last Sunday when you announced our divorce. Show everyone the mobility you've been performing away from while I worked night shifts to pay for care you didn't need." The silence stretched until Pastor Williams spoke. "Howard, if you're physically capable, please demonstrate that for our congregation who've been praying for your recovery." Slowly, reluctantly, Howard stood and walked normally to the front of the church, the same confident stride he'd used to announce his affair, now serving as evidence of his systematic fraud. 18 months, I said, my voice carrying across the sanctuary. 18 months of performing disability, while I worked myself to exhaustion funding his affair with the woman I hired to help him recover. But the most powerful moment came when Detective Morrison entered the sanctuary exactly on schedule, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. "Millie, are these the suspects?" Detective Morrison asked, looking at Howard and Bernice with the professional disgust reserved for people who exploit disability systems and caregiving relationships. "Howard Brennan and Bernice Morrison," I confirmed. 18 months of systematic disability fraud with complete documentation and expert testimony. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Howard looked at me with something I hadn't seen in months, genuine recognition of exactly who he'd been trying to deceive. "You have the right to remain silent," Detective Morrison began, but Howard was staring at me with the dawning realization that he'd tried to perform fake disability for someone who'd spent her entire career detecting exactly that kind of systematic fraud. "Mrs. Brennan," Detective Morrison continued, "your documentation and professional assessment made this one of the most comprehensive disability fraud cases we've ever prosecuted." The congregation watched in stunned silence as the man they'd prayed for and the woman they'd trusted were led away in handcuffs for exploiting the very community that had supported them. "Before we continue with service," Pastor Williams announced, "I want to say that Millie Brennan has shown us what real advocacy looks like. She used her professional expertise to expose systematic fraud and protect our community from continued deception." The church service that had begun with Howard's fake disability performance had just become the setting for complete justice and community vindication. They'd underestimated exactly who they were trying to deceive. The special education expert who'd spent 38 years protecting disabled students from exploitation had just applied those same skills to prosecuting systematic disability fraud and elder abuse. Howard and Bernice had tried to use my caregiving instincts and professional background against me while stealing my earnings and planning my removal. Instead, they'd awakened the advocacy instincts of someone who'd made a career of catching people who exploited disability systems for personal gain. The case was closed, and the verdict was decades in prison. 13 months later, I stood in my renovated home office, where I'd first analyzed the medical records that exposed Howard's fake disability performance. But everything had changed. The woman who'd once questioned her own special education expertise while being systematically exploited was gone, replaced by someone who'd reclaimed not just her time and energy, but her entire professional purpose. The legal proceedings had been swift and comprehensive. Howard pled guilty to systematic disability fraud and received 18 years in prison plus full restitution. Bernice faced charges for conspiracy and was sentenced to 12 years for her role in the exploitation. But more importantly, the entire disability advocacy community now understood exactly what had been done to Mildred Brennan. "Mrs. Brennan, it's Detective Morrison," came the familiar voice on my phone. "I wanted to let you know the final restitution payment came through. $72,000 in stolen earnings, plus $150,000 in damages and legal fees. Your case is officially closed." $222,000. Not just recovery, but justice with compound interest for systematic disability fraud and elder exploitation. "Detective, this case has become the national standard for disability fraud prosecution, hasn't it?" "Ma'am, in 25 years of criminal investigation, I've never seen a victim build such a comprehensive case against fake disability performance. The Department of Justice is using your assessment methods to train investigators in disability fraud cases nationwide." After I hung up, I sat at my desk, the same desk where I'd organized evidence that saved my career reputation and financial future. But now it held something different: correspondence from the National Disability Rights Network, requesting my consultation on developing protocols for detecting systematic disability fraud, targeting caregivers. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Dr. Sarah Chen, holding a folder of documents and wearing the professional badge of her new position as Director of Medical Fraud Prevention. "Millie, I heard about the final settlement and the disability rights consultation offer. How does it feel to be the most respected disability fraud expert in the country?" "Like I'm finally using my special education expertise where it matters most," I said, and meant it completely. For 38 years, I protected disabled students from exploitation. Now I'm protecting caregivers from disability fraud. Dr. Chen smiled. "The American Physical Therapy Association wants to establish the Mildred Brennan Protocol for detecting fake disability performance during treatment. Your case has changed how we approach patient assessment and caregiver advocacy." The Mildred Brennan Protocol, using the systematic fraud I'd survived to create protection for other caregivers who might be vulnerable to fake disability exploitation by family members. "Tell them yes," I said without hesitation. "If my experience can prevent other families from exploiting caregiving relationships through performed disability, then something meaningful will come from those 18 months of systematic deception." That evening, Pastor Williams came to visit. Something that happened regularly now that the truth about Howard's fraud was public knowledge and my professional reputation was fully vindicated. "Millie, our congregation has been asking me something. They want to know how you figured out such sophisticated disability fraud when even medical professionals were initially fooled." I considered the question carefully. I stopped making excuses for inconsistencies that didn't match my special education knowledge and started trusting my professional instincts. 38 years of disability assessment taught me to recognize when limitations were performed rather than genuine. Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "The church board wants you to lead our new elder protection ministry. Your case has shown us how family members can weaponize caregiving relationships against vulnerable adults." The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The woman who'd once worked herself to exhaustion funding fake disability care now spoke with unqualified authority about caregiver protection and fraud detection. My former principal, Dr. Martinez, stopped by later that week. "Millie, I have to ask, how did you maintain such detailed documentation throughout the exploitation? Most victims don't have nearly this level of evidence." 38 years of special education trained me to document everything. But more than that, I learned to trust my professional instincts when disability presentations didn't make sense, even when everyone else was accepting the performance as genuine. Dr. Martinez smiled. The State Department of Education wants you to develop training programs for special education professionals on recognizing disability fraud. Your case has changed how we approach family exploitation of educational expertise. The ripple effects continued expanding. The National Association of Special Education Teachers invited me to create protocols for detecting fake disability targeting educators. 3 universities requested permission to use my case in their disability studies and elder advocacy curricula. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services asked me to consult on detection methods for systematic disability fraud. But the most meaningful transformation was internal. The voice that had been systematically silenced through work exhaustion was now stronger than ever. If this story resonates with you, I said into my phone, recording a message for the Disability Fraud Prevention Program. Remember this: your professional expertise doesn't disappear when someone you love exploits it. Your ability to assess genuine versus performed disability doesn't diminish when family members use that knowledge against you. Your right to honest caregiving relationships doesn't expire when you become devoted to someone's recovery. I paused, thinking about the woman I'd been 13 months ago, working multiple jobs while questioning her own special education knowledge. I spent 38 years protecting disabled students from exploitation and advocating for genuine accommodations. I had to learn to apply those same protective skills to myself when my own husband became the one performing fake disability. The people who truly need care don't manipulate your expertise to exploit your devotion. They don't use your professional background as a weapon against your financial security. Real disability deserves real advocacy, not performance designed to steal your life. The recording would be used in training sessions worldwide, helping other special education professionals recognize when their expertise was being weaponized against them. As I hung up the phone, I realized the most profound change wasn't in my circumstances, it was in my voice. The woman who'd whispered questions about inconsistent symptoms now spoke with the authority of someone who'd survived systematic disability fraud and transformed it into protection for others. Howard had tried to steal my time, my money, and my professional credibility through 18 months of fake disability performance. He'd succeeded in exploiting me for over a year, but he'd never touched what mattered most: the special education expertise and advocacy instincts that had defined my career. In the end, those skills hadn't just exposed his fraud, they'd transformed me into someone who could protect others from the same systematic exploitation, while building the honest professional relationships I'd always deserved. Some people underestimate special education teachers at their own peril. We've spent decades learning exactly how to detect when disability is being performed rather than genuinely experienced, even when the performers are sleeping in our own beds.